The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said to his disciples, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He takes away every branch in me that does not bear fruit, and every one that does, he prunes, so that it bears more fruit. You are already pruned because of the word that I spoke to you. Remain in me as I remain in you. Just as a branch cannot bear fruit on its own unless it remains on the vine, so neither can you unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me and I in him will bear much fruit, because without me you can do nothing. Anyone who does not remain in me will be thrown out like a branch and wither. People will gather them and throw them into a fire, and they will be burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask for whatever you want, and it will be done for you. By this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. The Gospel of the Lord. So today we hit the central place of Acts. So far we've seen the success of the early apostles and their ministry, and then Paul and Barnabas were sent out on mission. And as they are evangelizing and saving souls, the question about circumcision arises. And it was no silly question. In the early days of Christianity, what they had inherited from Judaism is that circumcision would have been seen almost like we see baptism today. It would have been seen as necessary for salvation for Jews. It was a very important question. And so Paul and Barnabas did not think that people needed to be circumcised in order to be baptized and to become Christians. And there arose a great debate about this question. So Paul and Barnabas, they called a bunch of people together, and they consulted with the Bible to see what the Bible said about circumcision. That's actually not what happened. They didn't come together to consult the Bible. The Bible didn't exist yet. Instead, they went to Jerusalem, to where Peter was and the other apostles, and they had the first ecumenical council to discuss this question about circumcision. This is the first of many ecumenical councils in church history. Church history shows that as people go about proclaiming the gospel and evangelizing and spreading the faith, many important and practical questions arise with a lot at stake. And so how are those questions resolved? In our modern day, most Christians think that you solve them by consulting the Scriptures. The Scriptures didn't exist yet in the early church. Jesus didn't come and found a book. He came and founded a church. And the church is the authoritative body which answers these questions. As we'll see tomorrow when the question is resolved, I do think it's kind of striking, maybe something that we overlook, is that once this question had been decided, nobody has ever questioned it since then. In our modern age, there is so many different denominations among Christians because various dogmatic questions simply have not been settled by those different denominations. And yet as Catholics, thanks be to God, because of our ecumenical councils, we no longer debate about ancient questions. This might seem like it's not totally necessary. Maybe it seems like, well, maybe we make too much of this as Catholics. You know, there have been some ecumenical councils which were extremely significant. For example, in the 4th century, the example that I like to point to is that a majority of Christians in the world, especially those living in the East and in the Holy Land, they were teaching that Jesus was not really God. Seems pretty crazy. How could so many people be teaching that? It seems like the most basic of Christian teachings, and in fact it is. But again, when you start saying that Jesus is God, then you have to explain difficult questions. Does that mean that there are two gods? Does that mean that God the Father is completely equal with the Son? But Jesus said in his ministry that the Father was greater than he was. There are difficult questions that arise. And it's very important that we have a church to help us settle these questions. And the last thing I want to point out about what happened at the Council of Jerusalem, there would be a way of possibly misunderstanding what happened when the church came together. Sometimes when the Catholic Church joins together for an ecumenical council, people might think of it as the church creating new teachings. That's not the case. When the church comes together and convenes an ecumenical council, the church is not creating new teachings. Rather, the church is clarifying the teachings that have been in Christianity from the very beginning. The church doesn't need to make an ecumenical council until certain key doctrines have been questioned or challenged. Then the church comes together to clarify what has been the teaching from the beginning. St. John Henry Newman was famous for calling this the development of doctrine. The church doesn't change doctrine or create new doctrine. Rather, the church develops the original teaching and further clarifies it. An analogy he gives for the church today is that sometimes you might look at our modern church and you might think, man, there's a lot of added stuff, that wasn't there in the beginning. But that wasn't the church creating new teachings, it was developing. It was as if the church in the very beginning was just the tiny seed of the church, and now it has grown into this vast tree with all these different branches that have extended to all these different questions and scenarios and situations. So the church has developed. The church continues to adapt in every age, and yet the church remains the same. And the safeguard of that sameness, the safeguard of that teaching from the beginning, is not the Bible, it's not a pastor, it is the magisterium. All the successors of the apostles joined with the successor of Peter.